Alrighty, so some more introductions. Part three. This is part three, then, the third portion of this presentation for the presentation of for the performance of Digging Up God with Darwin for a Sacred Campfire. So, till now, I've talked about a little bit about Darwin, setting him as the central kind of focus of the discussion in general. We've gone through Einstein a little bit and mentioned a few of his observations about the interrelationship between science and religion from their own independent value, given their own independent value, and then Einstein's observation of epistemology, particularly in relation to science in his case. Now, I've made some notes on this page that I didn't mention. I didn't note anything about the fact that Einstein, as a physicist, as a secular Jewish physicist, makes for some interesting additional points. If we are looking at Darwin's context, for example. In Darwin's age, there was also Michael Faraday. While Darwin was an aristocrat, and then in terms of evolution, gets followed up by Alfred Russel Wallace. Hopefully many of you know that. Alfred Russel Wallace, of course, was not merely an object spouting out the same evolutionary idea, the same person as Darwin, spouting out, who did arrive at the essential ideas of evolution by natural selection as Darwin, based on his own exploration. But he was a different person, a different individual, with very different views of things in general, especially because he wasn't an aristocrat like Darwin was. And you begin to see those connections, as Alfred Russel Wallace, for example, was from a more modest background with more financial challenges that Darwin himself helped, by lobbying to get a pension for Wallace and help him out financially, in particular because of his work. So whereas Darwin had made the assertion and asked the question, what does Christ have to do with science? That already becomes an interesting demonstration. And I bring that up in terms of Einstein because Einstein himself only became famous after he got the spectacular recognition or climbed a certain ladder in the German world first, going from Switzerland back to Germany, and then to the United States eventually, which has its own kind of qualities. But if we just look at Einstein as a physicist, and we go back to Michael Faraday in Darwin's day, I guess Darwin was born in 1809, so Faraday then was a little bit older, but not just by a few 20 years or so in general, but was a teenager in the early 1800s, just as he was getting to know Humphrey Davies, who himself was a scientist, more privileged scientist. Now, Michael Faraday was from a very underprivileged background, but was a very spiritually and religiously from in England you already had these terms, dissenting and non-conforming kinds of contexts. And so I guess somewhat close, like the Quakers, they were dissenters. They were a non-Anglican denomination. I guess they were called the San Damianos. I'll have to check on the exact term. I get confused because there's a Brazilian denomination that uses a similar name, I believe. Now, I mean, we can also note that Einstein was Jewish, which really involves its own interesting intercultural issues, in which we see that the university culture, we see how important the university culture has been in civil rights, I guess is what we're talking about. In that, Einstein always referred back to Spinoza, who was quite the pioneer. He got excommunicated from his Jewish community as he was kind of doing his very free-thinking experience there. Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, whatever his names were, right? I guess he changed his name at some point. I also like to refer to Moses Mendelssohn, who is considered to be a pioneer in terms of the Jewish Enlightenment, Haskalah, right? It has this interesting name, interesting process that then is part of what's also called Jewish emancipation. It's an interesting process. So in Darwin's day, then Moses Mendelssohn had already been doing his thing, and there was also some prominent Jewish activity going on. So he's a good name to refer to. And Spinoza, in terms of his context earlier. The religious context, the religious question is a little bit different, and certainly gets at some of the more specific issues about Einstein's own personal beliefs and understanding that I'm not gonna really go into at the moment. So then we can move on to Gandhi then. I guess I already started to mention him. He was a lawyer, so we're talking about epistemology, right? The issue that Einstein had raised. Epistemology. Understanding the different subject matters and subject areas that give us clarity about our understanding and what we're talking about, and as we're trying to generate knowledge about the truth. For our own personal understanding of ourselves and our communities, and how we relate to the physical world as well, and how we build community, and how what kind of hope we have for transformation of ourselves, larger society, and the creation of a society that includes people of diverse kinds that we already have, right, in spectacular ways today, giving us the ability to have these kind of conversations with the UN human rights and sustainability and pro-social business models community. So Gandhi then, is himself at the same time as FDR, who I would also like to, I'll keep including because he plays actually in Einstein's context and in Gandhi's context very much. But, right, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a social gospel influenced American president, and who did various important things, including remaining on the alert about the threat of Nazism in Germany, and in particular then the fascism in military fascism in Japan, and then was able to also negotiate the issue of totalitarian communism in Stalinist Russia, and how that all played out, along with Mussolini and little issues there. Or issues there. So now Gandhi then, coming back to Gandhi, he was Indian, right? He came from India. He was born in India, and being Indian was his context. And how that relates to the British colony. It was the British colony of India at that time. And so Gandhi went to Great Britain then for law school, London, where I think I already mentioned that he, as a secular Hindu, he was not a practicing Hindu. Apparently he hadn't even read the Bhagavad Gita yet, and had been opposed to Christianity because of the nature of the Christians that he had encountered. Now in London, as a law student, in a short time, really, 2 years, maybe 3, Gandhi then, who maintained his practice as a vegetarian, secular vegetarian, got connected to a vegetarian society where he also met theosophists, interfaith theosophists. And with the interfaith theosophists, Gandhi then learned the concept of being an interfaith spiritual practitioner and having an interfaith spiritual path. So that he, first of all, reconnected to his own Bhagavad Gita, his own Hinduism from India, with a modern attitude then, this modern attitude of education, of educational thinking, and its relationship to philosophical scholarship with empiricism. And then also began to see that he could approach Christianity then with this kind of mentality, besides Jainism from India and Buddhism and so on, at least. And so, that's this fascinating context then as Gandhi then moved along, which illuminates what? The epistemology issue that Einstein raises, if we're using him as one of our sources, of course. Now, Gandhi then reflects a few things. Max Muller is the first one I want to note. Max Muller then was this German scholar who went to France for his studies in Indo-European languages, but with an orientation towards the culture. And from France, then he went to England and Oxford, as I already mentioned, and went from being an Indo-European language scholar to being a comparative religion scholar, based on the level of understanding that he was able to develop and his insights. And so, and then that illuminates then the whole issue of epistemology with Darwin, as I mentioned in my last talk, the last portion of the episode. All right, so I remember mentioning a few things there. So then in this slide, we might also mention Emerson in the United States, who wrote an essay, one of his famous essays called The Oversoul, based on his own study of Hinduism. Schopenhauer was also influenced by Hinduism as one of the first, after the founding of some efforts, earlier efforts by 1790 by William Jones, the English guy. Now, Gandhi being a lawyer, I also noted here because of another angle that gets into the social quality with the issue that, well, Darwin got involved with his local church parish, Down Parish, doing a social project there, helping laborers with maybe a reading room or some kind of recreational room. And Darwin then participating with Emma and as the treasurer and this kind of thing. But we also see that in Great Britain until 1871 or so, labor union organizing was illegal. So, whether or not there were various legal amendments made during that time, that it was illegal. It was prohibited. Labor union protests were organizing and strikes were prohibited in quite a then harsh environment. So that we have the innovation of the cooperative business model, the pro-social co-ownership cooperative business model that was innovated in Rochdale near Manchester, with a lot of inspiration from Robert Owen, who's his own important figure, who was influenced no less by a Christian doctor doing occupational health in the early 1790s. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace becomes an interesting contrast because he was very pro-labor and involved in that. Then, which also brings us back to Gandhi, in that his connection to the Theosophists involved Annie Besant, who had basically succeeded or become one of the succeeding leaders to Helen Blavatsky, from aristocratic Russia, and Annie Besant had been an important labor activist with important advocacy for women in Great Britain as well, like Alfred Russel Wallace was doing. So, and then we also have the issue of Spiritism, that Alfred Russel Wallace was interested in Spiritism. Theosophists, perhaps not so much necessarily, but that becomes another angle, and Darwin was opposed to Spiritism. So, because beside any fraudulent activity, there are also the implications that are corroborated by various examples that are quite astounding in their implications for metaphysical understanding, the understanding of metaphysical realms. Which, in going back to the physicist Einstein, we might then leap to the work of David Bohm, who referred to the implicate order and the explicate order, using the scientific concept there, that can also help understand that, among others. So then, and speaking of that, then we have the next character, Black Elk, an Oglala Sioux, and let me see here. Black Elk. So, Black Elk was born in 1863, so pretty close to Gandhi, for one. And at 9 years old, he was ill for some days, during which time he had a vision that he never shared, that he didn't share for some time, until his contact as an elderly man he shared with in a context that then became published in a book. And he referred to his experience, a vision experience that as he got older allowed him to become a healer. He was from a family lineage of medicine men and healers, no less, in the Oglala Lakota tribe, in the Native American context. And so a quote from Black Elk goes as follows about his vision. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell and understood more than I saw, for I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy. So that would be based on his later description of his vision at 9 years old. Now, Black Elk himself was involved in a variety of famous historical events. In 1876, he was the cousin of Crazy Horse. And in 1876, apparently he was still a warrior at that age and fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn, which was Custer's last stand, also called the Greasy Grass. A little bit later then, about 10 years later, he got involved with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, traveling to the United Kingdom, and then by accident or coincidence, spiritual coincidence or synchronicity, to other places in Europe due to a little bit of a misunderstanding. By 1889, though, it wasn't all that much time, but by 1889, then he was back on the Pine Ridge Reservation as the ghost dance situation was beginning, which I remember as kind of a rebellion, but it apparently wasn't really that wasn't really the context of it. It was a prophetic vision, yes. There were Christian elements in the vision already, including the spirit of pacifism that had spread by word of mouth to other tribes, where it began to get varying interpretations. And then as a result, it led to the 1890 Wounded Knee Massacre, which is, so that'd be interesting to research in more detail. But then Black Elk was able to rescue somebody there in minimal involvement that he had. All right, let me pause here. All right, rolling again. So, and then he became, during as he settled down into the reservation life, Black Elk then became a Catholic, who was really an interfaith individual with an interfaith spiritual path, in which he sustained his native shamanic identity and practices in combination with his Catholic actions. So I think he's even been nominated as a Catholic saint, given his something about him, some of his accomplishments, and how they understand him and from the Catholic point of view. So by 1932, he had met John Neihardt, a poet and some kind of literary figure or scholar, and began sharing his accounts for the book that John Neihardt wrote and others have also built on and contributed to. And then 2 years later, Black Elk also organized his own Indian show, teaching tourists about the culture and something about sacred ritual, including the sun dance. And by 1950, he passed away. So Black Elk then gives us, he has this reference to his vision that includes the Creator, Great Spirit kind of image of the flowering tree and the one sacred hoop. So the transcendental realm, we get an idea of the transcendental realm there. And then, he's got healings. I want to look into some kind of specific example of a healing, but it involved sacred herbs, pipes, and drums, as I recall, from the first healing that he accomplished. I wrote a song with a reference to that, no less. So that's Black Elk. And what else? So if we come back then to Darwin, in Darwin's day, he did have some contact, but it was more like part of what his discouragement in thinking about the influence and the nature of Christianity as he was viewing it. Since it was a character, a boy, a Native American boy from the Tierra del Fuego, the Tierra del Fuegans, Jimmy Buttons was one of these sort of goofy names that they came up for these for the ewes. I think there were 3 ewes that they were able to barter for, or that they were able to barter for, and one died, and then upon after being trained for some year or so in Great Britain, where they actually did learn a few things. As soon as they returned to, in a year or so, on the HMS Beagles, the second HMS Beagle voyage, with Darwin and Captain Robert Fitzroy, Fitzroy doing his second voyage, at least with the natives here, after having picked them up, they returned. They returned back to they became recidivists, right? They returned to their original cultural behaviors without the benefits of modern intercultural understanding. So now Darwin, and the impression of Darwin seems to have been more in terms of the ineffectiveness of Christianity, institutional Christianity as he was understanding it, doctrinal Christianity. Now, so Black Elk then, so that would be Darwin's direct understanding. Now, in Darwin's, the larger context of Darwin as a scholar, we have actually the earlier activity of Alexander von Humboldt, and who came from Germany, but since his efforts with a French sailing expedition, didn't work out in the 1790s because of Napoleon's activity. Alexander von Humboldt, with a French physician, Yves Bonpland, had gone to Spain then, in Madrid, and where he had then met various Spanish naturalists themselves, natural philosophers, as part of the Spanish Enlightenment. Benito Feijoo was a monk who had been encouraging that in the monarchy of the time, whatever it was. And so had gone to Alexander von Humboldt then had sailed on the ship Pizarro was sailing to Cuba, but they were rerouted because of typhoid on the ship to Venezuela. And that became then the coincidence or synchronicity where he arrived on the river, the Orinoco River, and had a number of interesting adventures, including electric eels, I like to mention with my kids. And then proceeded on and was climbing various mountains, including Pichincha in Ecuador, but then also proceeded to Mexico. And that's where his focus was more on, or at least his context or focus involved some of the Mexican or the Aztec cultural issues, or Central American and Aztec cultural issues involving proto-anthropologists, early anthropologists from that context, including Francisco J. Clavijero and Antonio Gama. Got to check these names. So that already is an early example of anthropological knowledge being developed that, had already existed, I guess, with the Catholics in Asia, with Jesuits in Japan, and Matteo Ricci, right, is the name I remember, from China. And then Christian Wolff in Germany had drawn on them in his own more atheistic, secularized work, drawing on that and looking at these at comparative religious issues. Now, from that same time of the early 1800s, and we have the revolutionary issues also as Alexander von Humboldt then later met Simón Bolívar. But returning to the native, keeping on the native theme, Scañadayo and Nanyehi from that era are there. Scañadayo, also known as Handsome Lake, around 1800, is an interesting story. A Seneca prophet whose visions helped cure his own alcoholism, helped cure the alcoholism of others, word of which got around and got to Thomas Jefferson, who was president, who then sent a letter to Scañadayo congratulating him or Handsome Lake as his prophet with his healing influence. That also became called Longhouse religion, that apparently has persisted, has some followers until today. Nanyehi was a Native American woman who had a vision that has been correlated with the Trail of Tears later on. So a little bit of a sadder context, but that does represent this phenomenon. And in more modern times, there's Joanne Tall, who I discovered in looking at some of these really excellent prizes. Goldman Environmental Prize, I think it was, has awarded her for her work as an activist, but in which she also shared about her having had visionary dreams that inspired her. So that's Black Elk and a variety of the contexts. Oh, we also have the more mainstream anthropology already beginning to be developed. E.B. Tyler, who was a Quaker, or used to have Quaker origins, Quaker upbringing, and had contact with another Quaker guy who was an ethnologist at that time. We're talking about the 1850s and so on, maybe already in the 1840s beginning, who became one of the founders of modern anthropology. Also Lewis Morgan in the United States. So E.B. Tyler in the United Kingdom, and Lewis Morgan, who was a lawyer who got involved with Native American culture and became a pioneering anthropological figure already at that time. So wonderful stuff in all of that. So that emphasizes this issue of epistemology that Einstein mentioned as we're looking at Darwin and understanding him as primarily a biologist who didn't really pursue the necessary format to provide really the necessary and appropriate answers to the questions that he raised about the wasp, right? And I guess we're already at a point where we can start to look at that, but I guess we have a few more steps we can still go to. The wasp stinging the caterpillar and laying its own eggs, and then the question of what relevance does Christ have for the sciences, first of all. So next we have Harriet Tubman, Ashanti Harriet Tubman. Ashanti being a nickname that was given to her that reflects her African origins, no less, which I thought was a nice touch. So Harriet Tubman is certainly a woman, and so we've got a reference back to Darwin and Emma, the meaning of Emma in Darwin's life. John Edmonstone, who was an African-descended ex-slave in Scotland, who had been involved, accompanied his owner in British Guyana sufficiently to become a taxidermist in Scotland. So that there was Charles Darwin in medical school, following his father's desires to become a medical doctor, but finding that he was more interested in naturalism or in naturalist activity, which natural philosophy, and becoming what we call today a biologist. And John Edmonstone. So then he took classes in taxidermy with John Edmonstone, this African-descended guy there and ex-slave in Edinburgh, while he was at the University of Edinburgh Medical School. Darwin was. Now, we've also got the context of abolition. Since Darwin was influenced and have been influenced by Unitarianism, as well as having touches of the Anglican Church, Unitarianism then was very involved in the abolition movement, but they weren't the originators of it, which is something worth noting, because that brings us back to the Quakers, the Quaker Friends, who were the source, it was Quakers who first began organizing around protests in general, social protests, and that spread to slavery of Africans, and particularly but slavery in general. And in the 1780s, then it was Quaker organizing that became the major spur that led to the abolition movement as a social movement and a social campaign in which university activity was inspired, and a university grad, Thomas Clarkson, who was an Anglican, dissented from the Anglican Church's position and recognized the Quakers after his essay. He had written a prize-winning essay, and trying to publish it, he got in touch with the Quakers. He also had a spiritual revelation, that he identified as spiritual in nature, about ending slavery, about his desire to end slavery. And he became the leader in quite a modern sense in organizing the campaign with the backing, in combination with the Quaker Friends and other assorted participants. And that included Olaudah Equiano, an African-born ex-slave who had grown up with a father chief who had African slaves himself in Africa. And as Olaudah Equiano then went on his way, he also had a Quaker owner who developed, negotiated a plan for Olaudah to buy his own freedom. So that's this wonderful thing. And then he joined, or helped to found or joined the Sons of Africa, that I haven't seen too much information about in detail, though I've seen it referred to. But Olaudah Equiano himself wrote an important book, and one that's still published today, that I have a copy of myself, having had quite a little bit of variety in his experience. I think he was in the Caribbean, certainly was involved in North American coasts, and then ended up in London at the minimum. Then that also gets us into Fred Douglass, right? We're talking about Harriet Tubman, and we haven't even talked about Harriet Tubman's. So Harriet Tubman then, as a woman, has her own interesting biography, which involves religious experiences. She had religious visionary experiences based on a physical injury that had happened, apparently, a head injury that was only serious enough in the sense that it stimulated her having religious visions. Apparently, I'd like to hear more research on that. And then by 1849, I was just getting clear about that detail. She escaped, and well, it's actually shows these complexities. She escaped in 1849 for the first time with two of her brothers, but for various reasons, feeling homesick or missing their girlfriend or something, her brothers wanted to return, and they forced her to return with them back to slavery. So she had to escape again, and she was able to escape again, and has a wonderful quote in recalling her experience in arriving in Pennsylvania, which I wrote where? Here? Something I put on the back here. Where she says, "When I found I had crossed the line, the border of Pennsylvania, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees. I felt like I was in heaven." Right? So Harriet Tubman. And so in Pennsylvania then, she got in touch with the Underground Railroad, which certainly seems primarily to have been initiated by the Quaker Friends. And William Still was an African-American guy who had gotten a job as a clerk at the Anti-Slavery Society. So the Anti-Slavery Society was the first thing, and then a vigilance committee, and then I guess that's the official name for what became the Underground Railroad from their angle. And he's credited with up to 800 escaped slaves, and his own interesting context. Now, in terms of legislation, there was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. That was part of the issue that affected the whole, created the responsibilities and accountability for being part of a nation, a single nation, right? So did the northern states were they bound by a national law, national legislation that was on the books and all of that? So, but Harriet Tubman then was able to go on 13 missions in her life. She was born in 1822, died in 1913. 13 missions, 70 enslaved people rescued, or she's credited with, along with the activities of others, like this William Still guy, who apparently is credited with up to 800 escaped slaves, and so on. So that is the wonderful angle. So, and then Harriet Tubman, then we refer back to what we're understanding, right? She had her religious visions, and so her context was never involved any kind of repudiation of Christianity or some kind of confusion of Christianity with any kind of version that was not based on the understanding of Moses as the liberator, and even Jesus somehow. I guess that would be a detail I'm not quite recalling, so that'd be interesting to refer to. But it also reminds me of Emma. If we looked at Emma as a Unitarian then, in her contact with Darwin, they were involved mutually in conversations thinking about Christianity and its meaning. And as already early in 1838, as they were, as Darwin either was verging on proposing to her or had proposed to her, she referred him to a quote in John about Jesus' loving nature. So I'm going to stop here.